Yeah, this thing's really laboring just to idle. Not a good situation to have. So what we're going to do is run our diagnostic tester, see if it'll narrow things down a little bit and give us an idea where to start looking. All right, so we're key on ignition and fire this thing up. Aha, the old P300. Now what that means, if you ever put one of these diagnostic testers on a car, pretty much any car, it's universal throughout, is that you've got a multiple cylinder misfire, which basically means you could have a whole host of problems, and the only way to really diagnose is get underneath the hood and start looking. So that's what we're gonna do. I'll bring Matt in here and maybe he can give me a hand finding the problem.
Like we said a little bit earlier, this truck has a good amount of miles on it, and these Fords are notorious for having problems with the spark plug. So we'll check that in a couple of minutes. But in the meantime, one of the most common things that throws up that particular code is a vacuum leak, and that's pretty easy to check. So we can come in here. Bruno, go ahead and fire that up.
Okay.
And what we're looking for is vacuum right around 20. Ideally is what we're looking at. So we're at 22. That's good. It's not moving. Obviously, we don't have a leak. Go ahead, man, we're good.
All right.
There's no vacuum leak here. Now, if you don't have one of these gauges handy, fortunately, there's another really easy way to check for a vacuum leak on the intake side.
Yeah, all you do is run down to your local parts store, get yourself some carb cleaner. Now, what you'll do is with one person running in the truck, keeping it running, you're gonna spray around the intake manifold. And the usual suspects for a leak are anywhere there's a gasket or there's a fitting, because what'll happen over time, sometimes those gaskets might get sucked in or cracked, or you might just get a leak anywhere along the outside of it. And spraying carb cleaner in, what it is to change the idle.
Right.
The fuel, this will actually act as a fuel and it'll get burned inside the engine and it'll change the pitch. So that means you've got a leak because it's sucking in the carb cleaner. But we don't have to do that here because we know right here from the gauge that we've got good vacuum.
So what would be happening in there potentially is your ECU's reading this and it's controlling the air-fuel mixture and the spark and all that, and you're getting this air kind of creeping in, and it's inconsistent, so it's getting different amounts and it's having to change all the time, and that's where the error is going to come in. You know, we talk about engines being a big air pump where air goes in and air comes out in specific areas, and it's a controlled environment. When that environment's not controlled, that's when the errors come up, and that's when the codes come up. Now we're ready to start ripping the plugs out of this truck, but we want to be careful when we do that. You know, the Fords are notorious for having the issues with the 4.6, 5.4, and 6.8. With the spark plug being a two-piece design, upon removal, they actually come apart. Now what happens is, you know, you pop this down in there and you're turning to get the plug out and you're thinking, hey, it's coming out nice and easy, this is good. And then you pull it out and boom, that's what you've got. This is stuck down in the head and you've got some issues. Now let's take a look at how that happens. Actually, take a look right here. This is where the plug goes in. We've already got one in there, all right? So that's in there nice and tight. Well, down here on the combustion side of things, you take a look at that. So this is the part of the plug that's exposed. So you got all the combustion going on right here. And over time, the carbon's going to build up around this little ring, and it's actually going to slide down in there as well. And it kind of seizes that part of the spark plug to the head, so that when you're popping it out on this end's holding. All that carbon's holding on nice and tight, and that's stuck right there. Now you've got some issues because you've got to get in there and get that part out. Now, one of the things that you can do if you're paranoid about that, or the experts will tell you it's just a good idea, especially if you have the time, is when you're taking the plugs out, go ahead in there, get the coil packs out of the way, and then spray some lube down in there and just hit that and let that work overnight. Then, maybe in the morning, it's going to be lubed up a little bit and you have a better chance of getting that two-piece plug out of there in one piece, and that's going to save you a lot of time.
Now before you pull the plugs out, you want to make sure that you blow out the spark plug holes with an air line to make sure all the dirt and debris you see here in the engine doesn't fall into the engine. So once they're cleaned out, you can pull the plugs out of the way and then check them. Alrighty. All right, here we go. Now at first glance, the plugs can tell you a lot. They're a great indicator as to what's going on inside of the engine. Now this one, while there's some rust around the outside of here, really if you look down at the electrode and the ceramic, this one looks pretty good. You can tell it's firing. It's got a little bit of a grayish tint to it. Now if it were to be white or the little electrode would be burnt out, you know you'd be having a misfire. You've got major detonation go on inside. The other thing you want to look for, if it's black or if it's oily, you've got another problem the other way. It's either dead, it's not firing at all. A lot of times if it's oily, it'll tell you that you've got oil being sucked past the ring, so you knock the rings out of it. But this one actually is pretty good right now. not showing any reasons why we're getting that error code at this point. So I think we'll go through and pull the rest of them out and see if we find anything along the way. Well, the first few plugs have looked pretty good. Let's see what we've got here. Yeah, this one could be bad news. You can tell that it doesn't have that nice gray look like the other plugs did, like it's been firing cleanly. And the electrode, well, it looks like it's a little bit worn down. Now the black here is what we're looking at down inside here by the ceramic and around the electrode. It shows that it's kind of it's probably got a misfire. It's not definitely firing cleanly. So this could be the simple answer to our P300 problem. I say we go ahead and change all the plugs with some new Champion plugs. I mean, these ones have 150,000 miles on it, and the truck's only supposed to go 100,000 miles between spark plug intervals, so he's gotten pretty lucky to date.
Yeah, he got away with something there, for sure. So what we're going to do is swap out all the plugs with these new 7989 Champion Ford plugs from Federal Mogul. And you take a look at this versus the plugs that we pulled out of here, right? And you look at this and you realize that right off the bat, there's a couple distinct advantages. First of all, the body of this plug right here, this Champion plug, is all CNC machined and it's one piece. So all of the concerns that we had with these about coming apart and breaking off in the head, we don't have to worry about that the next time we get in there and change these things out. Now, flashover is another thing that can occur in your spark plugs. And what flashover is when the electricity goes from here to the ground out body portion of your plug as opposed to running through and out the bottom where you actually want it to go. So this elongated post right here, the ceramic post, is about 20% longer than on this plug right here. So the flashover, that's a bigger gap for it to jump, and that's pretty much going to virtually eliminate flashover. So it's another thing we're not going to have to worry about. A lot of peace of mind here.
Now the last thing you want to do before you put the plugs in is double check the gap that comes from the manufacturer. They all come pre-gapped these days. The problem is though, the shipping guy who's bouncing these around and dropping them on the floor is killing the gap you've got between the ground strap and the electrode. The way you tell the proper gap is when you're picking out your plugs at the parts store, you reference a cross and it'll tell you what the gap is. Now for these plugs it's 44 thousandths, so you take your gapping tool and you just put in between here. Now there's a bunch of different ways you can check the gap. In the old school way was to use this little ring here, and so people would stick the ring in at 44, and what they would do incorrectly is they would wedge this down, and what they're doing is damaging the precious metal on the tip of the electrode. So the right way to do it is really to use one of these little wire gappers. So you put it in the proper place just to double check it. If you don't have enough gap, you got one of 3 different sizes for your ground strap on the electrode. You put it in here, and what you're trying to do basically is pull the electrode, the strap away from the precious metal. This way you'll get your proper gap. One thing, you just want to make sure you double check it so you have the right gap before you put them in the truck.
So when you go to put the new plugs back in, there's definitely one way to do it that's better than some of the alternative methods. Now, a lot of guys will just take it like this, and you've got your ratchet and everything, and you bang it down in there, and everything is rigid, right? So when this hits the bottom, you could hit that just like that on that ring down there and mess up your gap. Another thing you can do is, if you're not too careful, you can cross-thread it. Then you've got some other issues. Now, a better way to do that is to take some hose, or Champion has this little tool right here, and you stick that on, and there's no resistance, you know. It's not hard. You just slide it down in there and kind of feel around, and it'll get its way in there. Boom. You're not messing anything up, and you get it started. I like to just get it all the way till it's snug, and then you can put the wrench on it and just tighten it down, and then you're good. You know what? You're never going to cross-thread it with this.
Hey, welcome back to TruckU. One last thing you want to do when you change out the plugs, it's also a good time to change out the plug boots. Here's why. These plug boots are on these plugs themselves for 100,000 miles, and in this case 150,000 miles. Well, the boots have memory, so when you take out the plugs, this little rib right here will form into the boot. The problem is now we're going to go to one that doesn't have the ribs in it, it's just a straight plug, and you're going to have an issue where you've got air going through there. That means that you're running into a situation you can have flashover, and as Matt described earlier, that's not a good scenario to have. Now, even if you're going with a straight one to another straight, the diameters change on these ceramics, so you can have a point where you're not going to get a good seal. So here's a tip for you guys. Change the plugs, change the boots. It's just that simple. Now keep in mind that these Champion 7989 plugs are not just good for this engine. They're good for any 3-valve head, whether it's the 4.6, the 5.4, or the 6.8.